The ancient tractor sputtered and died right at the edge of Henry Wilson's property line. As the sun set over the failing crops, Henry approached the stranded woman with a toolbox in hand. His calloused fingers worked magic on the rusted engine, completely unaware that the stranger watching him with keen interest wasn't just passing through Shea, was Catherine Winters, the billionaire philanthropist who'd just purchased the abandoned factory at the edge of town. Her smile widened as she watched him work, already calculating how many zeros would appear on the check she planned to write. She hadn't come to Riverview by accident. This town, this farmer, they were all part of her plan. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Tomorrow's video will reveal what happens when a billionaire decides to change one man's life forever. The setting sun cast long shadows across the weathered fields of Riverview, a farming community that had seen better days. Henry Wilson wiped his brow with the back of his hand, leaving a streak of dirt across his forehead as he surveyed the day's work. The irrigation system had failed again, leaving sections of his corn withering under the relentless summer heat. At 42, the lines around his eyes had deepened with each passing season of struggle, each failed harvest pushing him closer to losing the farm that had been in his family for 4 generations. His pickup truck, a faded blue 1992 Ford with more rust than paint, sat at the edge of the field. The radio antenna was held together with electrical tape, and the passenger side mirror dangled precariously, secured by baling wire and determination. Like everything else in Henry's life, it worked just enough to get by. As Henry loaded his tools into the truck bed, he caught sight of something unusual on the horizon. A cloud of dust approached along the rarely used country road that bordered his property to the east. Squinting against the glare of the setting sun, he made out the silhouette of what appeared to be an old tractor, its engine making a sound that Henry recognized immediately as trouble. The tractor, a vintage John Deere that must have been at least 60 years old, lurched forward once more before letting out a final wheezing cough and dying completely. Henry watched as a figure climbed down from the driver's seat, a woman with a wide-brimmed hat shielding her face from the sun. She kicked at one of the tires in frustration before opening a small compartment on the side of the machine and peering inside. Henry hesitated. He had his own problems, a mountain of them, and daylight was fading fast. There was still the matter of the broken fence in the north pasture, and he hadn't even started on the paperwork for the bank. The loan extension was due by the end of the week, and, without it, he might have to face the reality he'd been avoiding for months. But something about the stranded stranger tugged at him. Maybe it was the memory of his father's voice, clear in his mind even 15 years after his passing. "Wilsons help their neighbors, son. That's just what we do." In Riverview, neighbors had become an endangered species as family farms folded one by one, giving way to corporate agriculture or simply abandoned to the elements. With a sigh, Henry grabbed his toolbox from the truck bed and began walking toward the stranded tractor. As he approached, the woman turned, revealing a face that didn't belong to Riverview. She wasn't young, perhaps in her late 50s, but there was a vitality about her that seemed at odds with the dying farmland around them. Her clothes were practical, but of good quality. Sturdy boots, jeans without patches, and a light blue button-down shirt rolled up at the sleeves. Not a farmer, Henry thought, but not a tourist either. "Having some trouble?" Henry called out, raising his voice over the gentle rustle of corn leaves in the evening breeze. The woman pushed her hat back, revealing silver-streaked hair pulled into a practical ponytail. "You could say that," she replied with a wry smile. "This old girl decided she's had enough for one day." Henry set his toolbox down and surveyed the tractor. It was in remarkable condition for its age, the metal polished to a shine that spoke of care rather than necessity. "Mind if I take a look?" he asked, already opening his toolbox. "Be my guest," the woman replied, stepping back to give him room. "I'm Catherine, by the way. Catherine Winters." She extended a hand, sun-spotted but strong. "Henry Wilson," he replied, shaking it briefly before turning his attention to the tractor. "This land's been in my family since my great-grandfather's time." Catherine nodded, looking out over the fields. "It's beautiful country. Reminds me of where I grew up." Henry made a non-committal sound as he examined the engine. The tractor was a 1952 John Deere Model B, a machine he'd only seen in photographs and at the county fair's antique equipment display. Despite its age, someone had maintained it meticulously until recently, it seemed. Fuel lines clogged, he diagnosed after a few minutes of inspection. And your timing's off a bit. Probably happened when it sputtered out. I can fix it, but it'll take some time. Catherine checked her watch. A simple design with a worn leather band. I don't suppose there's a hotel nearby? Henry couldn't help the short laugh that escaped him. Nearest hotel's in Lancaster, about 30 miles east. Riverview hasn't had anything like that since the textile mill closed in '98. End quote. Something flickered across Catherine's face. Interest, perhaps, or recognition, but it was gone too quickly for Henry to be certain. I see, she said. Well, I was hoping to reach Cedar Grove by nightfall, but that seems unlikely now. Henry hesitated, aware of the dilemma. Cedar Grove was another 20 miles west, and the sun was already dipping below the horizon. Even if he could fix the tractor quickly, it wasn't safe to drive that machine on these Everett roads after dark. I could give you a lift into town, he offered reluctantly. Mrs. Abernathy rents out rooms sometimes. It's not fancy, but it's clean, and she makes a good breakfast. Catherine considered this for a moment, then shook her head. I hate to impose further, but I'd rather not leave Adelaide here. She patted the tractor's fender affectionately. She was my grandfather's, you see. Sentimental value. Henry understood that better than most. His own tractor, a 1980s model that had been outdated even when his father bought it secondhand, was held together by spare parts and sheer stubbornness. He'd named it Lazarus, for its habit of coming back from the dead when least expected. Tell you what, he said, already regretting the words even as they left his mouth. I can work on it now, get it running enough to move it to my barn. It's about a quarter mile from here. He gestured toward the weathered structure visible in the distance. You're welcome to my guest room for the night, and I'll finish the repairs in the morning. Catherine's smile widened, revealing laugh lines around her eyes. That's incredibly kind of you, Mr. Wilson. Henry, he corrected automatically. And it's nothing. Like I said, my folks would haunt me if I left someone stranded. As Henry set to work on the tractor, Catherine stepped back to observe. She didn't hover or offer unhelpful suggestions, which Henry appreciated. Instead, she seemed content to watch the sunset cast its golden light over the fields, occasionally snapping photos with an expensive-looking camera she produced from her bag. The fuel line was indeed clogged, and Henry had to improvise with the limited tools he had on hand. He cleaned it as best he could, then bypassed the worst section with a length of rubber tubing he'd been carrying in his toolbox for emergencies. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it would get the tractor to his barn. You're quite resourceful, Catherine commented when he explained what he'd done. Henry shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. You learn to make do when the nearest parts store is an hour away, and you can't afford new anyway. The tractor started with a reluctant rumble that smoothed out after a few seconds. Henry showed Catherine how to nurse it along at a low speed, then got in his truck to lead the way back to the farmhouse. As they made their slow procession across the property, Henry couldn't help but wonder about his unusual guest. Catherine Winters didn't fit any category of visitor Riverview typically received. She wasn't a bank representative. They always arrived in sleek sedans, armed with clipboards and thinly veiled threats. Nor was she from the agricultural conglomerate that had been buying up failing farms in the area. Those people traveled in pairs, with identical polo shirts, and practiced sympathy. There was something different about her, something he couldn't quite place. The way she handled the antique tractor suggested familiarity with farm equipment, but her hands lacked the permanent stains and scars that came from a lifetime of agricultural work. And that Camerette was the kind professionals used, not a tourist's point-and-shoot. By the time they reached the barn, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Henry switched on the overhead lights, illuminating the cavernous space that housed his own tractor, a collection of implements in various states of repair, and the accumulated tools and treasures of 4 generations of Iraq farmers. Catherine carefully parked the John Deere next to Lazarus, creating an odd tableau of agricultural history side by side. She climbed down, stretching her back after the bumpy ride. "Nice setup you have here," she commented, looking around the barn with genuine interest. Henry followed her gaze, trying to see the space through a stranger's eyes. The barn had been built by his grandfather, expanded by his father, and maintained barely by Henry himself. The roof leaked in 3 places, patched with mismatched metal sheets. The concrete floor was cracked, with tenacious weeds pushing through in the corners. The workbench was organized but weathered, the tools arranged by frequency of use rather than any formal system. "It does the job," he said simply. Catherine wandered over to a wall where various license plates, old signs, and faded photographs were displayed. "Your family?" she asked, pointing to a black and white image of a man standing proudly next to a new-looking tractor, the very same one Henry now called Lazarus, though decades younger. "My dad," Henry confirmed, joining her. "That was the year he bought that tractor. 1982. Said it was the best investment he ever made." He didn't add that his father had died still making payments on it, or that Henry had nearly lost the farm twice since inheriting it. Catherine studied the photograph for a long moment. "He looks like a man who knew his own mind." Henry nodded, surprised by the accuracy of her assessment. "That he was. Stubborn as the day is long, my mother used to say." A comfortable silence fell between them as Catherine continued her examination of the memorabilia wall. Henry took the opportunity to assess what he'd need for the tractor repairs in the morning. The fuel line would need a proper replacement, not his makeshift fix, and he suspected the timing issues might be related to the distributor cap. "You hungry?" he asked eventually, realizing that the dinner hour had come and gone. "I can't offer anything fancy, but I've got soup on the stove and fresh bread." Catherine turned from the wall, the genuine smile lighting up her face. "That sounds perfect. I haven't had a home-cooked meal in weeks." They walked together toward the farmhouse, a 2-story structure that, like everything else on the property, showed signs of deferred maintenance. The white paint was peeling in places, and one of the shutters hung at a slight angle. The porch steps creaked under their weight, but the porch light cast a warm, welcoming glow. Inside, the house was modestly furnished, but clean. The living room contained a well-worn sofa, a recliner that had been Henry's father's favorite spot, and a television that was at least 15 years old. Family photographs lined the mantel above a fireplace that hadn't been used in years. Catherine paused in the entryway, taking it all in. "You live here alone?" she asked, noticing the single plate and coffee cup in the dish strainer. Henry nodded, leading the way to the kitchen. "Since my father passed, 15 years ago now. Mom died when I was in high school." He didn't mention his brief marriage, 2 years of increasing arguments ending in divorce papers delivered to the farm, along with an overdue notice from the electric company. Sarah had wanted children, a different life, security that Henry couldn't provide. He didn't blame her for leaving, but the empty rooms upstairs still echoed with what might have been. The kitchen was the heart of the house, with a large wooden table that could seat 8, but rarely saw more than Henry himself. The appliances were outdated but functional, and a slow cooker on the counter filled the room with the aroma of beef stew. "I hope you're not vegetarian," Henry said suddenly, realizing he hadn't thought to ask. Catherine laughed, a warm, genuine sound. "Far from it. That smells amazing." Henry served the stew beef, potatoes, carrots, and onions from his own garden while Catherine sliced the bread he'd baked that morning. It was a simple meal, but as they sat across from each other at the big table, Henry found himself relaxing for the first time in days. "So," he said, breaking a piece of bread, "what brings you to Riverview with an antique tractor?" Catherine took a sip of water before answering. "Would you believe me if I said chance? I was transporting Adelaide to a collector in Cedar Grove and decided to take the scenic route. I've always preferred back roads to highways." Henry raised an eyebrow. "Chance led you down Wilson Road?" "It's not exactly on any map." Catherine smiled enigmatically. "Perhaps not chance then. Let's call it intuition." Before Henry could pursue this line of questioning, Catherine deftly changed the subject. "This stew is delicious. Did you grow everything yourself? The conversation shifted to farming. Safe territory for Henry. He explained his crop rotation system, the challenges of the recent drought, and his experiments with more drought-resistant corn varieties. Catherine listened with genuine interest, asking insightful questions that revealed a deeper understanding of agriculture than Henry had initially given her credit for. "You know your stuff," he commented as they cleared the dishes. Catherine shrugged. "I grew up on a farm not unlike this one. Haven't lived on one in decades, but I guess some knowledge sticks with you." Henry wanted to ask what she did now, how a farm girl ended up transporting antique tractors and carrying professional cameras, but something in her manner discouraged personal questions. Instead, he showed her to the guest room upstairs, a simple space with a double bed, a dresser, and a window overlooking the eastern fields. "Bathrooms at the end of the hall," he explained. "Towels in the cabinet. The water runs rusty for the first few seconds, but it clears up quick." Catherine thanked him warmly, and Henry retreated downstairs to his office-converted pantry off the kitchen where he kept the farm's financial records. The loan extension paperwork waited on the desk, a reminder of the precarious state of his business. Henry sat heavily in the chair, pulling the papers toward him. The numbers hadn't improved since the last time he'd looked at them. The drought had reduced his yield by nearly 30%, and grain prices were at a 5-year low. The irrigation system needed replacing, not just repairing, and the north field required soil amendments he couldn't afford. The bank wanted a business plan, a path to profitability. What they didn't understand or didn't care about was that farming wasn't just a business to Henry. It was a legacy, a promise to generations past, and a responsibility to the land itself. The clock on the wall ticked steadily as Henry worked through the paperwork, making projections he knew were optimistic at best. It was near midnight when he finally pushed the papers aside, his eyes burning with fatigue. Tomorrow, he'd fix Catherine's tractor and send her on her way. Then it would be back to the daily grind of keeping his head above water, one day at a time. As he climbed the stairs to his own bedroom, Henry paused at the guest room door, hearing nothing but silence from within. His mysterious visitor was either asleep or as quiet as a mouse. Either way, by this time tomorrow, she'd be gone, and his life would return to its predictable struggle. He had no way of knowing how wrong he was. Morning broke with the insistent crowing of Frank, the rooster Henry kept more for tradition than any practical purpose. Henry was already awake, having risen before dawn to milk the small herd of dairy cows that provided a modest supplemental income. By the time he returned to the house, the smell of coffee filled the kitchen. Catherine stood at the stove, spatula in hand, a pan of sizzling bacon before her. "Hope you don't mind," she said, not turning around. "I'm an early riser, and thought I'd make myself useful." Henry set the milk pail on the counter. "Not at all. Haven't had anyone cook breakfast for me in years." Catherine had found eggs in the refrigerator and bread for toast. She moved with efficiency around the kitchen, as comfortable as if she'd lived there for years rather than a single night. Her silver-streaked hair was damp from a shower, and she'd changed into fresh clothes still, practical, still of good quality. They ate together at the kitchen table, the morning light streaming through the windows and illuminating the dust motes in the air. Henry couldn't remember the last time he'd shared a meal with someone in this house. Probably his father, before the cancer took him. "I looked at your tractor this morning," Catherine said between bites of eggs. "I think I know what's wrong with the distributor." Henry paused, fork halfway to his mouth. "You know tractors?" Catherine smiled. "I told you, farm girl. My grandfather taught me everything about that John Deere. I can't fix it myself. Any more arthritis in these hands, but I know what needs fixing." After breakfast, they walked together to the barn, where Catherine pointed out the worn distributor parts she'd identified. Henry was impressed her diagnosis matched his own assessment from the previous evening. "I have some parts that might work," he said, moving to a set of metal shelves where containers of salvaged components were meticulously organized. "May not be original, but they'll get you going." For the next few hours, they worked side by side on the tractor. Catherine couldn't handle the smaller tools with her arthritic fingers, but she was an excellent assistant, handing Henry what he needed before he asked, and offering suggestions based on her knowledge of the machine. As they worked, Henry found himself opening up about the farm, the community, and the challenges of recent years. Catherine was an attentive listener, asking questions that showed genuine interest rather than polite conversation. Riverview used to be something, Henry explained as he tightened a bolt. When I was a kid, we had a proper downtown grocery store, hardware store, diner, even a small movie theater. The textile mill employed half the county, and the farms were thriving. What happened? Ooh, what happened? Catherine asked, though something in her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Henry shrugged. Same thing that happened to small towns all over. The mill closed, moved operations overseas. The big agricultural companies started undercutting local farmers. Young people left for college and never came back. Now we're just a dot on the map that most people drive through on their way somewhere else. Catherine handed him a wrench. But you stayed. It wasn't a question, but Henry answered anyway. This land is in my blood. 4 generations of Wilsons have worked it. I can't be the one to let it go. He didn't add that he might not have a choice much longer. By noon, the tractor was purring as smoothly as a 60-year-old machine could. Henry wiped his hands on a rag, satisfaction warming him despite the knowledge that his visitor would soon be leaving. Good as new, he declared. Well, good as a 1952 tractor can be anyway. Catherine patted the fender affectionately. Adelaide thanks you. As do I. She reached into her back pocket and pulled out a checkbook. What do I owe you for the parts and labor? Henry waved a hand dismissively. The parts were just gathering dust, and the labor was a nice change from worrying about my own problems. Catherine's eyes narrowed slightly. I insist on paying for your time and expertise. Henry shook his head firmly. Wouldn't feel right. You shared your knowledge, cooked breakfast. Let's call it even. After a moment of consideration, Catherine nodded, tucking the checkbook away. Very well, but I'll find a way to repay you properly. They returned to the house, where Henry expected Catherine to gather her belongings and be on her way. Instead, she surprised him by asking if she could see more of the farm. I'd like to understand what you're working with here, she explained. If you have the time, of course. Henry hesitated, conflicted. On one hand, there was work to be done there, was always work to be done. On the other hand, he found himself genuinely enjoying Catherine's company. Her sharp mind and practical knowledge, a refreshing change from his solitary existence. I can spare a couple of hours, he decided. Let me show you around. They started with the fields closest to the house, 20 acres of corn, struggling in the summer heat. Henry explained the irrigation issues, pointing out the sections where the ancient pipes had finally given up. A new system would cost more than I'll make on this crop, he admitted. So I'm patching and praying for rain. Catherine examined the soil, rubbing it between her fingers. Good earth, she commented. Just thirsty. They moved on to the north pasture, where a small herd of dairy cows grazed lazily in the midday sun. Henry greeted each by name: Bella, Daisy, Marigold, and the others explaining their lineage and personalities. That one there, with the white star on her forehead? That's Comet. Her grandmother was the first cow I ever milked when I was about 6 years old. Nearly kicked me into next week, but Dad just laughed and showed me how to bathe. Sit properly on the stool. Catherine's expression softened at the story. You really do love this place, don't you? Henry looked around at the rolling fields, the weathered barn, the farmhouse in the distance. It's not just land to me. It's everything. My history. My future, if I can keep it. As they walked, Henry found himself sharing more than he intended: the financial struggles, the failed crops, the bank's increasing pressure. Catherine listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly just allowing him to speak. What about the other farmers? She asked as they paused by a fence line overlooking neighboring property. Are they facing similar challenges? Henry gestured toward the adjacent farm, where fields lay fallow and buildings stood in disrepair. The Johnsons sold last year. Couple from Lancaster bought it as a weekend place. Don't farm it at all. He pointed in another direction. Hendersons lost their place to the bank 3 years ago. Corporate farm now. And the Petersons? He shook his head. Pete's heart gave out, and his kids had no interest in staying. Land's been sitting empty since. So you're one of the last independent farmers in the area? Catherine asked. Henry nodded. Me. The Garcia's about 5 miles south. And old Jim Baker, though he's more retired than farming these days. Everyone else has either sold out or gone corporate. By the time they returned to the farmhouse, the sun was high overhead, and Henry's shirt was damp with sweat. Catherine, however, seemed energized by the tour, her face flushed with the warmth, but her eyes bright with interest. "Thank you for showing me," she said, as they stood in the shade of the porch. "It's a beautiful operation, despite the challenges." Henry felt a flush of pride at the compliment, quickly followed by embarrassment at his transparency. He'd revealed far more to this stranger than he'd intended, laying bare the precarious state of his livelihood. Something about Catherine inspired confidence, a feeling that she understood without pitying. "Well," he said, suddenly awkward, "I suppose you'll want to get on the road to Cedar Grove. It's a straight shot west from here, about 20 miles. Should take you about an hour on that tractor." Catherine checked her watch, then looked thoughtfully at the horizon. "Actually, I'm rethinking my plans. Would it be terribly inconvenient if I stayed another night? There's something I'd like to investigate in town tomorrow morning." Henry blinked in surprise. "In Riverview? There's not much to investigate there." A smile played at the corners of Catherine's mouth. "You'd be surprised what I find interesting. Of course, I'll pay for my room and board." Again, Henry waved off the offer of payment. "The guest room's just sitting empty anyway. Stay as long as you like." That afternoon, Catherine excused herself to make some phone calls, walking down the long driveway for better reception. Henry returned to his chores, tending to the animals and checking the irrigation system once more, though he knew the patches wouldn't hold much longer. When he returned to the house for dinner, he found Catherine at the kitchen table with papers spread before her. She quickly gathered them as he entered, but not before he caught a glimpse of what appeared to be architectural drawings. "Hope you don't mind soup again," he said, pretending not to have noticed. "It's even better the second day." Catherine smiled, tucking the papers into a folder. "I never turn down a good meal. Can I help?" They worked together to prepare dinner, moving around the kitchen with the easy familiarity of people who had known each other far longer than a day. As they ate, Catherine asked more questions about Riverview, its history, its people, the textile mill that had once been the town's economic center. "The mill's been vacant for almost 30 years now," Henry explained. "Big brick building on the edge of town. Used to employ 300 people in its heyday." Catherine nodded thoughtfully. "And no one's tried to repurpose it?" Henry shrugged. "A few developers have looked at it over the years. Nothing ever came of it. Too far from major highways, they said. Not enough local workforce anymore." After dinner, they sat on the porch, watching the fireflies emerge as dusk settled over the fields. The evening was warm but not uncomfortable, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of corn and distant rain. "Might get that shower after all," Henry commented, nodding toward the dark clouds gathering on the western horizon. "Though probably not enough to make a difference." Catherine hummed in agreement, her gaze fixed on the middle distance. "Henry," she said after a comfortable silence, "what would you do if money wasn't an issue for the farm?" The question caught him off guard. "What do you mean?" "If financial constraints were removed, if you could invest in the farm as you see fit, what would you do first?" Henry leaned back in his chair, considering. It had been so long since he'd thought beyond mere survival that the question felt almost foreign. "Well, the irrigation system, obviously. Replace the whole thing with a modern setup, then soil amendments for the north field. It needs lime and organic matter. New equipment. That tractor of mine is on its last legs, and the barn roof needs Cossin, replacing before winter." As he spoke, the vision expanded in his mind, not just repairs, but improvements. "I'd like to diversify a bit. The dairy operation is small but profitable. Could expand that. Maybe add some specialty crops. There's a growing market for organic produce in Lancaster, and solar panels on the South Shed. Power bills are killing me." Catherine listened intently, nodding occasionally. "You've given this some thought." Henry laughed ruefully. "Dreams cost nothing. Implementation's the problem." They sat in silence as the first distant rumble of thunder reached them. The storm was still miles away, but moving in their direction. "I should check on the animals," Henry said, rising from his chair. "Make sure everything's secured before that hits." Catherine stood as well. "I'll help." Together, they made a circuit of the farm, ensuring the cows were safely in the barn, the chicken coop was secure, and any loose equipment was stored away. By the time they finished, the first fat raindrops were beginning to fall. They ran the last few yards to the porch, laughing as the rain suddenly intensified. Henry couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed like that genuinely, without the weight of worry pressing down on him. "Perfect timing," Catherine said, shaking water from her hat. "Though, I think Adelaide might need a tarp over her. The barn roof has that leak right above where we parked her." Henry was touched by her concern for the old tractor. "Already took care of it. Put a tarp over both of them before we came in for dinner." Inside, they dried off and settled in the living room. Catherine asked about the family photographs on the mantel, and Henry found himself sharing stories he hadn't revisited in years. His father's determination to keep the farm during the 1980s farm badal crisis, his mother's legendary apple pies that won blue ribbons at the county fair, his own adventures growing up as a farm kid in a time before screens dominated childhood. It was nearly midnight when they finally said goodnight, the storm still drumming steadily on the roof. Henry lay awake for some time, listening to the rain and wondering about his mysterious guest. Catherine Winters was unlike anyone he'd met, knowledgeable about farming, but clearly not a farmer anymore, capable and independent, but with an easy warmth that made her feel like an old friend rather than a stranger he'd met just yesterday. He found himself hoping she might stay longer than one more night, though he knew that was unlikely. People like Catherine didn't belong in dying towns like Riverview. She had places to go, a life somewhere else. Tomorrow she would leave, and Henry would return to his solitary existence, fighting a losing battle against economic forces beyond his control. The rain continued through the night, a steady downpour that would help his crops, but wouldn't solve the underlying issues. Henry finally drifted off to sleep with the sound of water drumming on the roof, a rare moment of peace in a life filled with constant worry. The next morning dawned clear and fresh, the world washed clean by the night's rain. Henry rose at his usual early hour, completed his chores, and returned to the house to find Catherine already in the kitchen, coffee made, and breakfast underway. "I hope you don't mind," she said, gesturing to the French toast sizzling in the pan. "I found the bread going stale and thought this would be a good use for it." Henry inhaled the cinnamon-scented air appreciatively. "Mind? I haven't had French toast since—" He trailed off, unable to remember the last time. After breakfast, Catherine announced her intention to drive into town. "I'd like to look at that old mill you mentioned. Would you be able to point me in the right direction?" Henry hesitated, then made a decision. "I'll do better than that. I'll drive you there myself." He had work to do, always had work to do, but something about Catherine's interest in the derelict building intrigued him. Besides, after the rain, the fields would be too wet for certain tasks he'd planned. They took Henry's pickup truck, rattling down the country roads toward the small town center. Riverview had once been a bustling community of about 3,000 people. Now, the population sign at the edge of town claimed 1,200, but Henry suspected that was optimistic. Main Street was a study in decline. Empty storefronts with faded, "For Lisa" signs, a gas station that had seen better days, and a small grocery store that charged prices so high most locals drove the 30 miles to Lancaster for their shopping. The once grand courthouse stood at the center of town, its white paint peeling, steps cracked from years of neglect. "Town council can't afford the upkeep," Henry explained as they drove past. "Budget's been cut every year for the past decade." Catherine took it all in with interest, occasionally making notes in a small notebook she produced from her pocket. She seemed particularly interested in the layout of the town, the placement of key buildings, and the few businesses that remained open. The textile mill dominated the eastern edge of town, a massive brick structure that had once been Riverview's beating heart. 4 stories tall with rows of large windows, many now broken. It was an imposing reminder of more prosperous times. "It's been vacant since 1994, Henry said, as they pulled into the cracked parking lot. Owner just locked the doors one day, filed for bankruptcy. 300 people lost their jobs overnight. Catherine studied the building, her expression thoughtful. May I look inside? Henry raised an eyebrow. It's not exactly safe. Floors probably rotted through in places. I'll be careful, she promised. I'm just curious about the structure. Henry sighed, then nodded toward the truck's glove compartment. There's a flashlight in there. I know a way in that doesn't involve breaking anything. They walked around to the loading dock at the rear of the building. One of the large doors was loose, the padlock hanging uselessly from a hasp that had pulled free of the rotting wood. Henry pushed it open, the hinges protesting with a screech that echoed through the cavernous space beyond. The interior was a cathedral to abandoned industry. Huge open floors where machinery had once stood, high ceilings with skylights that allowed dappled sunlight to illuminate the dust dancing in the air. The smell of oil and metal lingered, overlaid with the mustiness of decades of neglect. Catherine moved through the space with purpose, examining the structural elements, the electrical infrastructure, the loading dock mechanisms. Her interest seemed professional rather than merely curious, and Henry found himself wondering once again what she did for a living. The roof has held up well, she commented, shining the flashlight toward the ceiling. And the brick is in excellent condition. These old buildings were built to last. Henry nodded, following a few steps behind. They don't make them like this anymore. Catherine moved to the center of the main floor, turning slowly as if visualizing something Henry couldn't see. How many floors total? 4, plus a basement where they kept the boilers and some storage. Catherine made more notes in her little book, occasionally stopping to take measurements with a small laser device she produced from her pocket. Henry watched in growing puzzlement. This was no casual interest. Catherine was assessing the building with a professional eye. Mind if I ask what exactly you're looking for? He finally inquired, as she examined an old electrical panel. Catherine glanced over her shoulder with a slight smile. Just gathering information. I have an interest in historical industrial architecture. It wasn't a complete answer, but Henry didn't press. They spent another hour exploring the mill, with Catherine documenting various aspects of the structure, and Henry sharing what he remembered from childhood visits with his father, who had delivered cotton to the loading docks. Twice monthly. The whole town would be different if this place was still operating, Henry mused as they prepared to leave. Not just the jobs, but the sense of purpose, community. Catherine nodded thoughtfully, taking one last look around the cavernous space. One building can change everything, she agreed. They stopped for lunch at Mabel's Diner, the only restaurant left in Riverview. The small establishment had been a town fixture for over 50 years, outlasting the mill and most other businesses through sheer determination and the loyalty of its customers. Mabel herself, now in her 70s but still spry, greeted Henry warmly. Wilson, haven't seen you in weeks. Who's your friend? Catherine Winters, Catherine introduced herself, extending a hand. Just passing through. Mabel's eyebrows rose slightly at the unfamiliar face. Riverview rarely saw visitors these days. Well, welcome to our little town. What'll you have? They settled into a booth by the window, where they could see the quiet main street. The diner was half full, mostly with older residents nursing cups of coffee and sharing the latest town gossip. Henry recognized most of them. The retired postmaster, a few former mill workers, the high school math teacher who had taught Henry algebra 25 years earlier. As they ate their sandwiches, Catherine asked more questions about the townette's governance, the community's needs, the distance to larger markets. Her curiosity seemed boundless, and Henry found himself revealing more than he might have to another stranger. The town's biggest problem is jobs, he explained. Without the mill, there's nothing to keep young people here. The farms that are left are struggling. The school might close next year because enrollment's so low. Catherine listened intently, occasionally making notes in her book. And if the school closes? Henry shook his head grimly. Families with kids will leave for sure. Might be the final nail in Riverview's coffin. After lunch, Catherine asked to see more of the town. They walked the short length of Main Street, with Henry pointing out what businesses had once occupied the now empty storefronts: the hardware store, where his father had bought tools; the barber shop where Henry had gotten his first haircut; the small bakery that had made wedding cakes for generations of Riverview couples. Catherine took it all in, her expression thoughtful. They passed the community center, a modest building that housed the town's library, open 2 days a week now, due to budget cuts, a small gym, and meeting rooms used for town council sessions and community events. Building's sound, but the heating system's ancient, Henry explained. Almost had to close last winter when the boiler gave out. Town scraped together enough for repairs, but it's on borrowed time. By late afternoon, they had seen everything Riverview had to offer. As they drove back to the farm, Catherine was unusually quiet, seemingly lost in thought. "Sorry the grand tour wasn't more exciting," Henry said, breaking the silence. "Not much to see these days." Catherine turned from the window to look at him. "On the contrary, I found it fascinating. Thank you for showing me around." Back at the farm, Catherine excused herself to make more phone calls, again walking down the driveway for better reception. Henry returned to his chores, puzzling over his guest's intense interest in a dying town. Perhaps she was a journalist working on a story about rural decline, or an academic studying the economic impact of factory closures. Whatever her purpose, Henry found himself enjoying her company, her sharp mind, and her genuine interest in his life and community. It had been a long time since he'd had a real conversation with someone who seemed to truly listen. That evening, they sat on the porch after dinner, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. The fields glowed golden in the fading light, the corn stalks standing tall after the previous night's rain. "Beautiful," Catherine murmured, taking a photograph with her expensive camera. "You have a piece of paradise here, Henry." Henry smiled wryly. "Paradise with a past-due mortgage." Catherine lowered her camera, turning to face him directly. "Tell me something. If you could change one thing about Riverview, what would it be?" Henry considered the question, watching a hawk circle lazily above the distant tree line. "Opportunity," he said finally. "The town needs a reason to exist beyond history, something to give people jobs, hope, a future to build toward." Catherine nodded slowly. "And for your farm?" "Security," Henry replied without hesitation. "Not just making it through this season, but knowing there will be a next season, and one after that. Farming isn't just a job. It's a continuum. What I do today affects the land for years to come. Hard to plant for the future when you're not sure you'll be here to see it." They fell into a comfortable silence as darkness crept across the fields. Fireflies began to blink among the corn rows, nature's own constellation mirroring the stars appearing overhead. "I should leave in the morning," Catherine said after a while. "I've imposed on your hospitality long enough." Henry felt a surprising twinge of disappointment. "You're welcome to stay longer if you need to." Catherine smiled, the motion illuminated by the porch light. "You're very kind, but I have matters to attend to. However, I'd like to come back in a few days, if that's all right with you. There are some things I'd like to discuss." Henry raised an eyebrow. "Things?" "Professional matters," she clarified. "I'll explain when I return. For now, let's just enjoy this beautiful evening." They sat in companionable silence until the mosquitoes drove them indoors. Before retiring for the night, Catherine surprised Henry by asking for a tour of his office. "I'm curious about how you manage the business side of farming," she explained. Henry showed her the converted pantry with its metal desk, filing cabinets, and ancient desktop computer. Nothing fancy. Spreadsheets for tracking expenses, calendar for planting and rotation schedules, files for all the government paperwork. Catherine examined the system with interest, asking questions about his record-keeping, tax filings, and business planning. Her questions were specific and knowledgeable, further convincing Henry that there was more to Catherine Winters than a casual interest in agriculture. "Thank you," she said when the tour was complete. "I appreciate you being so open with me." Henry shrugged, uncomfortable with the formality. "Not much to hide on the farm. What you see is what you get." Catherine's smile was warm but enigmatic. "Sometimes what you see is just the beginning." The next morning, Henry awoke to find Catherine already up and about, her small suitcase packed and ready by the door. She had made coffee and prepared a simple breakfast of eggs and toast. "I wanted to thank you properly before I left," she explained as they sat down to eat. "Your hospitality has meant a great deal to me." Henry waved off the thanks. "It was nice having someone around for a change. The house gets quiet." After breakfast, Henry helped load Catherine's few belongings onto the John Deere. The antique tractor gleamed in the morning sunlight, running better now than it probably had in years. "Remember, the fuel line is still not original," Henry cautioned. "If you're taking this to a collector, you might want to mention that." Catherine nodded, securing her bag to the tractor's fender. "I'll be sure to tell them." As she prepared to leave, Catherine handed Henry a business card. It was simple but elegant, with just her name and a phone number. No title, no company name, no address. "I'll be in touch in a few days," she promised. "In the meantime, if you need anything, don't hesitate to call." Henry pocketed the card, doubting he would use it but appreciating the gesture. Safe travels. Hope Adelaide behaves herself the rest of the way. Catherine climbed aboard the tractor, settling into the seat with practiced ease. "I'm sure she will, thanks to your expert care." With a final wave, she started the engine and began making her way down the long driveway. Henry watched until the tractor disappeared around the bend, then turned back to the farmhouse, already mentally organizing the day's tasks. The farm seemed oddly quiet without Catherine, though she had only been there for 2 days. Henry threw himself into his work, catching up on the chores he'd set aside while playing tour guide. The irrigation system needed attention again, and the bank paperwork still waited on his desk, a constant reminder of the precarious state of his finances. That evening, after a solitary dinner that tasted blander than the same soup had the previous nights, Henry sat at his desk and pulled out the loan extension forms. The numbers hadn't improved, but they needed to be submitted by the end of the week. As he worked, Catherine's business card sat on the corner of the desk. Henry found his gaze returning to it periodically, wondering about the woman who had briefly entered his life and shown such interest in his failing farm and dying town. The next 3 days passed in a blur of routine feeding animals, checking crops, patching equipment, fighting the never-ending battle against entropy that defined farm life. Henry tried not to think about Catherine's promised return, telling himself it had been a polite fiction, a way to make her departure less awkward. So when a sleek silver SUV pulled into his driveway on the 4th day, Henry was genuinely surprised. He had been working on the tractor, trying to coax a few more months of life from its aged engine, and didn't immediately notice the vehicle's approach. The sound of a car door closing caught his attention, and he looked up to see Catherine walking toward him. She was dressed differently than before: crisp tan slacks, a white blouse, and a light blue blazer that somehow matched the color of her eyes perfectly. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she carried a leather portfolio under one arm. "Catherine," Henry greeted her, wiping his hands on a rag as he stood. "Didn't expect to see you back so soon." Catherine smiled, the expression warming her professional appearance. "I told you I'd return. Do you have some time to talk?" Henry gestured toward his grease-stained clothes. "Let me clean up first. Meet you at the house?" Catherine nodded and headed toward the farmhouse, while Henry quickly washed up at the outdoor spigot. As he followed her to the porch, he noticed a second vehicle pulling into the driveway, a black sedan with tinted windows. "Expecting company?" he asked, nodding toward the approaching car. "Yes," Catherine replied. "My associate, Marcus Reed. I hope you don't mind that I asked him to join us." Before Henry could respond, the sedan parked, and a tall black man in his 40s emerged. He wore a charcoal gray suit and carried a similar portfolio to Catherine's. His manner was professional but friendly as he approached the porch. "Mr. Wilson," he said, extending a hand. "Marcus Reed. It's a pleasure to meet you. Catherine has told me a great deal about your operation here." Henry shook the offered hand, increasingly confused. "Nice to meet you too, though I'm not sure what's going on." Catherine gestured toward the porch chairs. "Perhaps we should sit down. We have a proposal we'd like to discuss with you." They settled on the porch, Henry's curiosity mounting by the second. Catherine opened her portfolio, extracting several documents. "First, I should properly introduce myself, she began. My name is indeed Catherine Winters, but what I didn't tell you is that I'm the founder and CEO of Winters Agricultural Innovation. Henry blinked in surprise. Winters Agricultural Innovation was one of the largest independent agricultural technology companies in the country. They specialized in sustainable farming systems, irrigation technology, and soil health solutions. Every farmer knew the name. "You're that Catherine Winters?" he asked incredulously. Catherine smiled. "The very same. Then Marcus here is my Chief Operations Officer." Henry's mind raced, trying to process this new information. But why the charade? The broken-down tractor? Staying here? No charade, Catherine corrected gently. Adelaide genuinely broke down, and I genuinely appreciated your help, but I will admit that I've had my eye on Riverview for some time. Marcus took over the explanation. Our company is expanding its research division. We've been looking for a location to establish a new agricultural research and development center, focusing on sustainable farming practices for climate-challenged regions. Catherine nodded. Your farm in this community caught my attention during our site selection process. When Adelaide conveniently broke down on your property, I took it as an opportunity to get to know the area, and you. Henry leaned back in his chair, trying to absorb the implications. So the questions about the mill, the town, due diligence, Marcus confirmed. We're considering purchasing the old textile mill building and converting it into our new AR center. It would create approximately 150 jobs initially, with potential for growth. Henry's heart raced at the number. 150 jobs in Riverview would transform the town overnight. Catherine leaned forward, her expression serious. But that's only part of what we're here to discuss. My company is also interested in establishing a partnership with local farmers to implement and test our new technologies. Which brings me to the second part of our proposal. She slid a document across the small table toward Henry. It was printed on thick paper with Winters Agricultural Innovation letterhead. We would like to offer you a position as our local agricultural liaison. You would continue to operate your farm, but with our financial backing for improvements in equipment. In exchange, you would implement our sustainable farming systems and provide feedback on their performance in real-world conditions. Henry stared at the document, speechless. Catherine continued, her voice gentle but businesslike. The position comes with a salary of $75,000 annually, plus performance bonuses based on crop yields. Additionally, we would provide capital investment for farm improvements, irrigation systems, soil amendments, equipment upgrades to be repaid through a profit-sharing arrangement rather than traditional loan structures. The numbers swam before Henry's eyes. $75,000 was more than triple what the farm had netted in its best year under his management. Marcus added, We're making similar offers to the other remaining independent farmers in the area, the Garcias and Mr. Baker. Our goal is to establish Riverview as a hub for agricultural innovation, connecting traditional farming knowledge with cutting-edge technology. End quote. Henry found his voice at last. Why here? Why my farm? Catherine's expression softened. Multiple reasons. The geographical location is ideal for our research purposes, varied soil conditions, moderate climate challenges. The existing infrastructure of the mill building is perfect for our needs with relatively minor renovations. The available workforce in the surrounding area includes both experienced agricultural workers and people with manufacturing backgrounds. End quote. She paused, then added more personally. And, after spending time with you, I'm convinced you're exactly the kind of partner we need, someone with deep knowledge of the land, commitment to sustainable practices, and the adaptability to embrace innovation. Henry rose from his chair, needing to move as his mind processed this life-changing proposal. He walked to the porch railing, looking out over his fields, the land his great-grandfather had first plowed, where generations of Wilsons had worked and sweated and sometimes thrived. This would change everything, he said finally, turning back to face them. Not just for me, but for the whole town. Catherine nodded solemnly. That's the intention. We believe in revitalizing rural communities through sustainable agriculture and innovation. Riverview could become a model for this approach. Marcus extended another document. We've already had preliminary discussions with the town council about the mill purchase. Mayor Thompson was enthusiastic, to say the least. Henry laughed shakily. I bet he was. He gestured to the papers. Can I take some time to review these? It's a lot to process. Of course, Catherine assured him. Take all the time you need. We'll be in the area for the next few days, meeting with the other farmers and finalizing details with the town council. As they prepared to leave, Catherine hung back, letting Marcus walk ahead to the cars. Henry, she said quietly, I want you to know that regardless of your decision, it was a genuine pleasure getting to know you and learning about your farm. What you've accomplished here, despite all the challenges, is remarkable. Henry studied her face, seeing sincerity in her eyes. Thank you for that, and for being straight with me now, even if you weren't entirely forthcoming before. Catherine smiled ruefully. I've found that when people know who I am, they show me what they think I want to see. When I'm just Catherine with a broken-down tractor, they show me the truth. With that, she joined Marcus at the vehicles. Henry watched them drive away, the documents clutched in his hand, containing the potential salvation of not just his farm, but his entire community. That evening, Henry sat at his kitchen table, carefully reading through every word of the proposal. It was comprehensive, detailing not just the financial arrangements, but the technological implementations, reporting requirements, and partnership structure. The more he read, the more he realized that this wasn't a corporate takeover disguised as a partnership. It was a genuine collaboration that valued his knowledge and experience. The salary alone would solve his immediate financial problems. The capital investment would transform the farm's productivity. And the connection to Winter's agricultural innovation would provide access to resources he'd never dreamed possible. But beyond his personal gain, the impact on Riverview would be profound. 150 new jobs would bring families back to the area, revitalizing the school, reopening businesses on Main Street, breathing life back into the community that had raised him. Henry called the Garcias that night, curious if they'd received a similar offer. Maria Garcia confirmed they had, her voice vibrating with cautious excitement. It sounds too good to be true, Henry. But Catherine Winters has a reputation for integrity. Her company has done similar projects in other states. Old Jim Baker was more skeptical when Henry reached him. Big companies always have angles, son. But I'm reviewing it with my grandson. He's a lawyer in Lancaster. Says the terms look solid so far. Henry slept little that night, his mind racing with possibilities. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to think beyond survival, to imagine a future where Wilson Farm didn't just endure but thrived. The next morning, he called the number on Catherine's business card. She answered on the second ring. Henry, she greeted him warmly. I was hoping to hear from you. I have some questions about the proposal, he said, getting straight to the point. Of course. Would you like to meet in person? Marcus and I are having lunch at Mabel's Diner at noon. Henry agreed, and a few hours later found himself sliding into a booth across from Catherine and Marcus. The diner was busier than usual. Word of Winter's agricultural innovations, interest in the town having spread like wildfire. For the next hour, they answered his questions about the technology implementations, the profit-sharing structure, the timeline for farm improvements, and the plans for the research center. Catherine was patient and thorough, never rushing or dismissing any concern, no matter how small. One last question, Henry said as they finished their coffee. Why the tractor? Why drive an antique John Deere instead of flying in on a corporate jet like most CEOs would? Catherine smiled, a hint of mischief in her eyes. Adelaide belonged to my grandfather. He taught me to farm with that tractor. When I started my company, I promised myself I'd never lose touch with the realities of farming. So for initial site visits, I drive myself. No entourage, no corporate trappings. Just me and Adelaide, connecting with the land and the people who work it. Her expression grew more serious. The breakdown was genuinely unplanned. But I believe in signs, Henry. When your field was where Adelaide chose to stop, and you were the one who came to help with skill and kindness, expecting nothing in return, I took notice. Henry nodded, understanding better now. So, what happens next, if I say yes? Marcus outlined the next steps: contracts to be signed, initial funds to be transferred, assessments of the farm's needs to be completed, and implementation of the first phase of improvements to begin within 30 days. And the mill? Henry asked. How quickly would that project move forward? We've already made an offer to the current owner, Catherine explained. If accepted, renovations would begin within 60 days, with the facility operational in approximately 8 months. Henry took a deep breath. I need to talk to my lawyer in Lancaster, have him review the contracts, but assuming everything checks out, he extended his hand across the table. You've got yourself a partner. Catherine's smile was radiant as she shook his hand. I'm very glad to hear that, Henry. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. Henry's lawyer confirmed that the contracts were not only fair, but generous. The paperwork was signed, and within days, a team of agricultural engineers from Winters Innovation arrived to assess the farm's needs and develop an implementation plan. The irrigation system was the first priority, with work beginning immediately to replace the aging infrastructure with a state-of-the-art precision system that would reduce water usage by nearly 40% while basher. Improving crop health. New soil sensors were installed throughout the fields, connected to a monitoring system that would alert Henry to changing conditions before problems developed. Catherine visited regularly, overseeing the progress personally, and often rolling up her sleeves to work alongside the installation teams. Her knowledge of both traditional farming practices and cutting-edge technology allowed her to bridge the gap between the engineers and Henry's practical experience. We're not replacing your expertise, she assured him one afternoon as they reviewed the soil analysis reports. We're augmenting it. Your understanding of this land, its quirks, its history, how it responds to weather patterns, that's knowledge no algorithm can replace. Meanwhile, the town of Riverview hummed with renewed energy. The sale of the mill was finalized, and construction crews arrived to begin renovations. The first phase of hiring began, with priority given to local residents and those with connections to the community who might return if jobs were available. The impact was immediate and profound. The grocery store expanded its hours. The hardware store, which had been on the verge of closing, suddenly found itself supplying tools and materials to workers renovating homes in anticipation of new arrivals. Mabel's Diner added dinner service for the first time in a decade to accommodate the construction crews. 3 months after Catherine's old tractor had broken down at the edge of Henry's property, Wilson Farm was transformed. The new irrigation system was fully operational. Soil amendments had been applied to the northern fields, and the barn roof had been completely replaced. The farmhouse itself had received needed repairs, with new windows, fresh paint, and an updated electrical system that finally brought the building into the 21st century. Henry found himself not just surviving, but thriving. The daily struggle for mere existence had been replaced by exciting challenges of implementation and innovation. His knowledge was valued, his experience respected, and for the first time in years, he looked to the future with hope rather than dread. On a crisp autumn day, as the corn harvest proceeded with the help of new equipment that cut the work time in half while reducing waste, Catherine arrived for one of her regular visits. She found Henry in the newly renovated barn office, reviewing data from the field sensors on a computer system that would have seemed like science fiction just months earlier. "How's it looking?" she asked, settling into the chair across from him. Henry grinned, turning the monitor so she could see the charts. Yields up 22% from last year, despite the drought conditions in August. And the quality metrics are even better. Catherine nodded, pleased but not surprised. The Garcia farm is showing similar results, and Jim Baker's grandson has decided to take over his operation full-time, says there's a future in farming here now. They walked together out to the fields, where the harvest continued under the warm autumn sun. The farm looked different, new, more organized, better equipped, but still unmistakably Wilson land. Henry had insisted on preserving certain elements that connected the place to its history, including the weathered sign at the entrance that his grandfather had carved by hand decades ago. "You know," Catherine said, as they watched the new combine move efficiently through the rows of corn, "when I started this company 15 years ago, this was exactly the vision I had. Not just developing technology, but putting it in the hands of people who understand the land, who care about it as more than just a resource to be exploited. Henry nodded, understanding completely. It's never been just a business for me. It's a legacy, a responsibility. They continued walking, discussing plans for the winter cover crops and spring planting. As they crested a small rise, the town of Riverview came into view in the distance. Even from here, the transformation was visible: construction equipment surrounding the old mill building, new roofs on previously deteriorating structures, activity where there had been abandonment. The research center is ahead of schedule, Catherine informed him. We should be operational by early spring. The first round of scientists and researchers will be relocating in February. Henry shook his head in wonder. I still can't believe how quickly everything has changed. Catherine smiled, her gaze taking in the revitalized farm and the town beyond. That's how renewal works sometimes. It can take years of struggle just to stay in place. And then suddenly, everything shifts at once. As they turned back toward the farmhouse, Henry was struck by a realization. You know, I never really thanked you properly. Not just for the partnership and the investment, but for seeing the potential here when everyone else, including me, sometimes had given up. Catherine's expression was thoughtful. I didn't create the potential, Henry. It was always higher in the land, in the community, in you. I just provided the resources to let it flourish again. The sun was beginning to set as they reached the farmhouse, casting the same golden light that had illuminated their first meeting months ago. But this time, instead of illuminating decay and struggle, it shone on renewal and possibility. Will you stay for dinner? Henry asked as they climbed the newly repaired porch steps. I've been experimenting with that recipe you shared, the one with the roasted vegetables. Catherine accepted with a smile, and together they entered the farmhouse that now looked toward the future rather than the past. In the town of Riverview, lights began to come on in homes that had stood empty for years. The community center hummed with activity as a planning meeting for the spring festival, the first in over a decade, drew to a close. At the renovated mill building, now bearing the winter's agricultural innovation logo, the last construction crew of the day packed up their tools, their work bringing the structure back to life after years of abandonment. And on Wilson Farm, where an antique tractor had broken down by chanceur, perhaps by Dizina, a struggling farmer and a visionary philanthropist prepared a meal together, their unlikely partnership having sown the seeds of revival for an entire community. As darkness fell, the lights of the farmhouse glowed warmly, a beacon of hope on the landscape. Inside, plans were being made, ideas shared, a future envisioned that honored the past while embracing innovation. The farm that had been in danger of slipping away was now at the forefront of a new beginning, not just for the Wilson family, but for all of Riverview. The ancient tractor that had brought them together sat in a place of honor in the renovated barn, restored to its original glory, but now serving as a reminder rather than a necessity, a bridge between farming's storied past day and its promising future. In the kitchen, Henry stirred a pot of soup, adding herbs from the new greenhouse Catherine had insisted on including in the farm improvements. You know, he said thoughtfully, my father used to say that farming was the art of perseverance, of showing up day after day, no matter what. Catherine nodded, slicing fresh bread from the town's newly reopened bakery. My grandfather said something similar. He believed that true strength wasn't just in enduring, but in adapting and finding new ways to honor old wisdom. Outside, a gentle rain began to fall, nurturing the cover crops recently planted in the harvested fields. Within its drops lay the promise of next season's growth, the perpetual cycle of renewal that had sustained this land for generations and would continue to do so for generations to come. The struggling farmer who had fixed a stranger's tractor, unaware she was a philanthropist with plans for his town now, stood at the threshold of a new chapter. The helping hand he had extended without expectation of reward had set in motion a transformation beyond imagining, proving once again that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can yield the greatest harvests of all. Through the kitchen window, the lights of Riverview twinkled in the distance, no longer a reminder of what had been lost, but a promise of what was yet to come. And in that moment, both Henry Wilson and Catherine Winters knew with absolute certainty that the seeds of revival they had planted together would continue to grow and flourish, nourished by the perfect balance of innovation and tradition, of respect for the past and hope for the future. In the warm light of the farmhouse kitchen, two people from very different worlds shared a meal and a vision of Accra. Community reborn, a legacy preserved, and a future where the wisdom of generations past would guide the innovations of tomorrow. And as the rain continued its gentle cadence on the roof above, that vision took root, just as surely as the seeds in the fields beyond, ready to grow into something extraordinary when the new season arrived. The story of Riverview's revival was just beginning, but already it was sending ripples far beyond the boundaries of the small farming town. Other struggling communities had taken notice, other corporations were reconsidering their approach to rural investment, and other farmers were finding new hope in the example set by Henry Wilson and his unlikely partnership with Catherine Winters. For in the end, it wasn't just about saving one farm or revitalizing one town. It was about demonstrating a new path forward, a way of honoring agricultural traditions while embracing the possibilities of the future. It was about proving that with the right combination of innovation and respect, the wisdom of the past could indeed light the way to a more sustainable tomorrow. And it had all begun with a simple act of kindness, a struggling farmer stopping to help a stranger with a broken-down tractor, unaware that in fixing her engine, he was helping to ignite the spark that would ultimately renew Accra. His entire world,